was the damn 33rd in Spec Ops The Line? One thing that truly fascinated me was this unit and their history. We hear so much about them during the game's events and even fight them throughout. So today I wanted to break down who they really were and how they ended up caught in the chaos of Dubai's devastating sandstorm. After finishing their deployment in Afghanistan, the 33rd Infantry Battalion was headed home. However, their unit was volunteered by their colonel, Conrad, to help evacuate Dubai after a devastating sandstorm hit, the worst the city had ever seen in its entire history. Since the 33rd were nearby, the colonel felt it was only right to lend a hand. However, the early evacuation efforts quickly failed as the storm made conditions too dangerous and unpredictable for them to move. As the crisis worsened, bigger than they could have ever imagined, U.S. Central Command ordered the 33rd to pull out, regardless of how many civilians were left behind. However, the colonel was unwilling to abandon the people of Dubai, so the 33rd ignored the order and chose to stay, continuing their efforts to rescue as many civilians as possible. Because of this, the US military officially disavowed the damn 33rd, and the UAE government ultimately declared the area a no man's land. With every escape route out of Dubai sealed and all communications cut off once the storm wall hit, tensions quickly spread among the people of Dubai and even those within the 33rd. As supplies would run extremely low, the 33rd, acting out of desperation and looking to keep the supply lasting as long as possible, began to enforce martial law and violently enforce these rules, punishing those who did not listen. These decisions would actually fracture the 33rd from within, who were already dealing with a lot of doubt, and this would split the 33rd into two opposing groups. Soldiers who remained loyal to Colonel Conrad became known as the Damned, while those who opposed him, led by much of the unit's leadership, formed a rival faction called the Exiles. This would lead to a small civil war between the Damned and the Exiles, and as the fighting would spread throughout the city of Dubai, only the civilians would truly be affected. And to make matters worse, the Damned ultimately won due to their sheer amount of numbers. This would be a massive blow to the civilians of Dubai who actually supported the exile. After the Damned's victory, Colonel Conrad would order the execution of the remaining stragglers from the exile, and their bodies were hung throughout the city as a warning to anyone thinking of rising up again. Soon after the end of this civil war, Colonel Conrad made one last desperate attempt to evacuate Dubai and its civilians. He organized a convoy to lead survivors out of the city. However, another massive wave of powerful sandstorms hit, destroying the convoy and killing more than 1,300 soldiers and civilians. The few survivors were forced to return to the city, where tensions between the remaining members of the 33rd and the refugees only grew worse. What the Damned didn't know, however, was that before the defeat of the exiles, they armed and trained some of the civilians within Dubai, which later sparked an insurgency of sorts against the 33rd. Now, as the conflict began to escalate, the 33rd managed to negotiate a very fragile ceasefire between both sides to avoid another civil war, though the situation remained extremely tense and unstable. Eventually, the secret arrival of a CIA team tasked with investigating and possibly covering up the 33rd's actions in Dubai only made matters worse and further caused strain of the agreed upon ceasefire. Now, in about 5 months after the failed evacuation convoy, Conrad delivered a final radio broadcast acknowledging his failure to save the city, which was eventually picked up by U.S. Central Command. Now, soon after, overwhelmed by guilt and the collapse of the situation around him, Colonel Conrad took his own life. Command of the remaining 33rd then fell to the unit's radio man, Robert Darden. After receiving Colonel Conrad's final broadcast, U.S. Central Command covertly sent in a Delta Force recon team led by Captain Martin Walker, a former soldier who had previously served under Conrad, to have a better understanding of the situation and confirm that the 33rd and Colonel Conrad were still there. However, by the time Delta arrived, the CIA had already figured out that if the rest of the world found out what the 33rd did, it would cause massive problems worldwide. And so they decided to create a plan where they deliberately caused the fragile peace and the ceasefire to collapse. And this led to Dubai being in a full-blown open warfare once again. This would cause the 33rd to go back on the offensive and use these brutal tactics in an attempt to regain control of Dubai. Now, during the campaign of Spec Ops The Line, the CIA and Captain Walker's Delta team are successful in killing and fully eradicating the damn 33rd, or at least what was left of it. Now, from the outside, it's easy to judge everything that happened in Dubai. But what do you do when your superiors order you to abandon the people who are still depending on you, the people that you swore to help? And when supplies begin running low, you know that the civilians will eventually turn on each other just to survive. They're going to fight for food, for water, or whatever is left. In that kind of situation, is trying to control the chaos the best chance of survival, even if it means crossing moral lines? That is what Colonel Conrad and the damn 33rd had to deal with. Those are the questions that they had to ask. I'm not saying that what he did was right. I'm not saying what he did was wrong. Honestly, I don't know. But what I do know is that I wouldn't want to be the one forced to make that decision. And so this was the story of the damned 33rd.
This is Colonel John Conrad, United States Army. Evacuation of Dubai ended in complete failure. Death toll, too many.